you've noticed in doing fall yard work that after the leaves are all raked and you sit down exhausted from the task, you feel really good that the work is done. And then you are almost in pain the next morning after a windy night to discover that the yard is again full of leaves. Projects like yard work are never really completed, are they? Even when the seasonal work is done, another season comes, and there's a new set of tasks to complete. This is the kind of lesson we learn again in our scriptures this morning. After 3 years, the disciples had completed their work with Jesus. Salvation had been won through Christ. He appeared to them in many ways after the resurrection, and now they stood on a deserted hill in Bethany, watching him ascend to glory and heaven. It was a very private moment for them, each feeling confusion and joy and praise. Matthew tells us that before Jesus ascended, he commissioned them to go out and make disciples of all nations. And remember that he was always with them. Mark tells that the disciples left the hilltop and proclaimed the good news everywhere. In Luke's gospel, he tells us that they returned to Jerusalem and continued worshiping. But then, in Luke's volume of the Acts of the Apostles, he goes on to describe the scene after Jesus was taken up. He says that 2 messengers appeared and said to them, "Why are you looking up at the sky? Jesus will come back." Jesus doesn't just go back to heaven saying, "You got your salvation, folks. Kick back and enjoy." Jesus leaves the disciples with work to do. They may have thought that the project was completed, but another season was on its way. They stayed in Jerusalem for 10 days and worshiped and waited, not sure what they were waiting for. Then, day of Pentecost arrived. Pentecost, or Shavuot, was the third of the pilgrimage feasts after Tabernacles and Passover, which we've talked about. It was the feast of first fruits, and people flocked to Jerusalem once again to celebrate. And as the city swelled, the followers of Jesus, including the disciples, gathered together, and something amazing happened. The thing for which they had unknowingly been waiting. The Holy Spirit came like a rush of breath, a violent wind, and filled the entire house. Flames of fire rested on their heads, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. Try to imagine that for a moment. Wind swirling around in the room, fire that does not consume overhead. It must have been overwhelming being filled with the Spirit. Can you imagine? Filled. And they began to speak in other languages, the languages of the cosmopolitan city they were in. Latin, Egyptian, Parthian, Phrygian, and Crete. Even people outside the followers' gathering place noticed what happened. It became very public very quickly. Many people in the crowded streets were amazed and bewildered and wondered what was going on. But the always present naysayers sneered and said, "That whole lot is drunk." Many commentators believe that after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, the disciples went into hiding or kept a low profile because they were afraid. But on the day of Pentecost, they were outed in the streets of Jerusalem when the Holy Spirit blew in and filled them with ability. So Peter, the disciple whom Jesus left as the leader, went out in the streets to address the crowd, the intrigued as well as the cynical. And Peter announces that a new season has arrived and there's more work to do. He quotes a very famous passage from the prophet Joel, "And look to the day when God would pour out his Spirit." And Peter says, that day has come. Peter proclaims that Jesus, who was crucified and who rose from the dead, is indeed Messiah and Lord, the Redeemer of the people. In that moment, the people meant Jews only. But later, Peter would recognize the universal nature of God's redeeming work and include Gentiles, all people, especially those who were different from them. This story can really hit home for us if we take it in. Before Pentecost, following Jesus, accepting what Jesus taught, giving one's heart to Jesus was a personal, almost private thing. And it was mostly about what Jesus did for me. But if our maturity stops there, we don't grow up in faith. There must be another phrase that follows what Jesus did for me, and that phrase is, so that I can do. Jesus saved my life so that I can do something, so that I can do something, so that I can do even more and more. Personal faith is not private. It's really not faith if we keep it to ourselves. At least it's not Christian faith. Being forgiven and saved doesn't mean anything unless it gets us moving and doing and being more than we were before. And what we will learn from the Acts of the Apostles is that it's not only about outreach, feeding people who are hungry, clothing people who don't have clothes, helping the sick and grieving. Those things are very important in the Christian faith. But our faith is also about learning to accept others who are different than we are. One of the things the early disciples had to do was get over themselves. They had to get over their prejudices. They had to get over looking at some people as other. They had to get over the religious bias that was so much a part of their upbringing that they didn't even know it was there. They had to get over looking at some people warily because they were not clean, or they smelled, or they spoke another language, or they had tattoos, or they dressed differently, or because they were white. In order to make disciples of all nations, they had to get to know people, eat with them, work beside them, fellowship with them. and stop judging them from an uninformed point of view. They had to stop giving lip service to openness and be open. And this is what the symbolism was all about. When the Holy Spirit came and the followers of Jesus began to speak in the languages of the migrant people flocking into Jerusalem. Just as God had come and had to be human in order for us to understand what divine love meant, followers of Jesus must become like those that we are trying to reach. We must walk with others and learn about them first, so that we can speak their language and relate to their circumstance. In challenging our uncomfortableness, we can begin to minister to others who are not like us. This was a huge challenge for the disciples as they spread out from Jerusalem to other places and then other nations and other cultures. And this remains a huge challenge to us. Open doors in Methodism doesn't just mean that others can come and join us, especially if they're just like us. It also means that we also walk out those open doors and reach out to people, even if we are a little or a lot uncomfortable, even if it means we have to learn about other ways of being and living in order to speak in a language that others will be able to understand. The beauty of Pentecost is that the Holy Spirit will give us the ability to do something with our personal faith. But it's up to us to be willing, to be courageous in caring for others closer than arm's length. Yes, Jesus leaves us with work to do.